Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the myths of ancient Greece. Today we'll be talking about Hercules and the Olympic Games. Every 4 years, the world watches the Olympic Games, an ancient and revered competition that celebrates the human spirit. Of course, it was done differently in ancient Greece. It involved whippings, pig sacrifices, and a cheating emperor. Oh, and according to myth, it was founded by Hercules, and that'll be the focus of today's presentation. First, we'll talk about Hercules' fifth labor at Iliia, the first Olympic Games, the events held during the Greek Olympics, and what it was like to attend one of these games. The Olympic Games began over 2,700 years ago in the city-state of Elis, in southwest Greece. According to Greek myth, they started with the fifth labor of Hercules, one of a series of 12 great tasks Hercules had to perform to atone for the murder of his children. For the fifth labor, he was sent to clean the cattle stables of King Augeas of Elis, one of the many half-human sons of Apollo. And being a god's illegitimate son has its perks. Hercules got superhuman strength, and Augeas was gifted 3,000 inhumanly healthy cattle. However, being superhumanly healthy meant these cattle had powerful bowel muscles, and their stables were filled with 30 years' worth of feces. When Hercules presented himself to King Augeas, Augeas challenged Hercules to clean the stables in 1 day, a truly Herculean task. Hercules accepted the challenge, insisting on 300 of the cattle if he won. King Augeas agreed, and after bringing in Augeas' son Phileus as a witness, Hercules went to work. Rather than shovel out the stables, Hercules tore open one of the walls, then used his super strength to divert the Alpheus and Pheneus rivers into the stables, cleaning them out. Hercules then went to a stunned King Augeas, demanding his 300 cattle. And when King Augeas refused, Hercules took the modern-sounding solution of filing a lawsuit against the king. However, before the courts could rule in Hercules' favor, King Augeas banished Hercules and his own son Phileus to save himself. To the Greeks, this was an example of a king becoming a tyrant. A king used his power to serve justice, while a tyrant used power to serve himself. However, Hercules had a very ancient-sounding solution to his problem. Later, Hercules returned to Elis with an army that included many other Greek heroes like Jason, all brought by the promise of justice and loot. Hercules and his comrades in arms took the walls and ransacked the city. Zeus, the king of the gods, sent lightning to King Augeas' palace, which the Augean troops took as a sign that Zeus was angry with him, and they abandoned their king. Thus it was with little trouble that Hercules killed King Augeas and put Phileus on the throne, with a warning that he must always govern as a king and not a tyrant. And to thank his father Zeus for his role in the victory, Hercules celebrated by holding games. He paced out the first Olympic racetrack with 600 of his own footsteps, and judging by the racetrack's 600-foot length, Hercules likely wore size 13 shoes. The first Olympic race was held by Coroebus of Elis, a former subject of King Augeas who had defected to Hercules' side. When he won the foot race, he took a slave girl as his prize. And after the race, Hercules further honored Zeus by planting an olive tree in his name. These first games are believed to have been held in 776, and they continue to be held in honor of Zeus, Hercules' father. Every 4 years, they were held in a valley near the city of Elis, itself near the larger state of Olympia. People came from across the Greek world to come and watch and compete in these games. However, in the early days, they weren't just going to the Olympic Games. The Olympics had to compete with other pan-Greek games held throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. By dedicating the games to the king of the gods, the citizens of Olympia set their games apart. And to further set themselves apart, the city fathers of Elis built something a little more impressive than Hercules' olive tree. If you traveled to Olympia, you would have seen the great temple of Zeus, built in 435 BC. The temple itself wasn't anything truly extraordinary, but inside there was a huge statue of Zeus, sitting on a throne covered in gold and ivory. The Zeus statue stood 6 times bigger than a man, though it sat down, and at the time people called it one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was said to have laughed out loud when the Roman Emperor Caligula tried to move it to Rome. And to see a full video on the statue of Zeus at Olympia, see the link in the description. The statue of Zeus helped to set the Olympic Games apart from the other games, and soon they took paramount importance over all the other games. Indeed, they took on a religious importance. Now, you have to keep in mind that most of the time, the city-states of Greece were at war with each other over borders, trade routes, or even a good hillside for growing olive trees. And this made traveling between states a little hazardous. So messengers from Elis would announce a sacred truce of 1 month before the games began. During the sacred truce, no city could make war upon one another, and if they did, their athletes would be banned from the games and their home city expected to pay a fine. In 420 BC, the Spartans were penalized for breaking the sacred truce, and to get back in the games, they had to pay a fine expensive enough to buy 6,000 oxen. Now, according to tradition, the first one-day Olympic Games featured a single event, a short sprint from one end of the Elis track to the other. In time, enough events were added to make the games last for 4 days. These events included wrestling, boxing, the long jump, throwing the javelin and discus, and chariot racing. The pentathlon alone had 5 events in one sitting, done one after the other: running, javelin, discus, long jump, and wrestling. Greek racing tracks, remember, were much wider than ours. 20 runners could race at once on a single track. The pankration, or all-in wrestling, had few holds barred. While eye gouging was technically not allowed, it still happened. Boxers wore leather gloves and could keep hitting opponents after they fell on the ground. But the toughest event among the tough events was the hoplite race, a foot race between men who wore armor and carried shields. Every one of these athletes strove to be like Hercules, the original founders of the games. And whether they ran or wrestled or threw the discus or the javelin, they did so to be like Hercules and to worship Hercules. Winners in any of the events received a wreath of leaves. They also enjoyed a hero's welcome when they came home. An Olympic victor could expect to marry a rich woman, eat free meals, get invited to high society parties, and enjoy the best seats in the theater. About 50,000 people could fit into the Elis Stadium. Most of the people who came to watch the games had to sleep rough, either sleeping in tents or wrapped in blankets on the ground. The hot and crowded stadium did not have a water supply. You had to simply walk to the nearest well if you wanted a drink. But on the plus side, there were no gate fees. The costs were covered by rich Olympian families and the Elis treasury. And despite the hardships, traders came to do business, poets and acrobats performed for athletes and spectators, and unfortunately politicians came to make speeches. And any trouble that people had along the way would likely be forgotten with a feast of roast ox meat at the end of the games. So, who ran the Olympic Games? While the rules of the Olympics were drawn up by a committee of lawmakers, a group of 10 men called the judges of the Greeks really ran the show. Judges were chosen by lottery from among the big shots of Elis. They sent out the heralds, punished city-states that broke the sacred truce, and organized entry competitions. Judges also paid for staff, usually slaves, who would not only whip cheaters, but they would also get oil so that the athletes could make themselves nice and shiny. And you have to keep in mind that the Greek athletes of this time competed not wearing a stitch of clothing. Before the games began, the judges would lead the athletes on a 36-mile walk from Elis to Olympia, and at a midway point, they did a ritual bath and sacrificed a pig to thank Zeus. Once they arrived in the Olympic stadiums, the judges put on lush purple togas, provided the athletes with official equipment, and served as referees. Cheating tended to be rare, as offenders could be whipped for fouls, breaking rules, or trying to bribe judges. And this kept the games pretty honest for about 800 years, until the Emperor Nero spoiled everything. Late in his reign, Nero went on a tour of Greece, giving concert performances where attendance was mandatory. During his musical performances, which could go on for hours, women faked going into childbirth and men pretended to die just to get out. And in AD 65, Emperor Nero decided to crown his Greek tour by competing in the Olympic Games. Nero even ordered that the Games be moved from AD 67, their scheduled date, to AD 65. Such a thing had never been done before in the history of the Games, by then over 800 years. One can only imagine the fear the judges knew as Nero climbed into his 10-horse chariot to drive in the race. He fell off halfway through, had to be helped back in, and even failed to finish. However, the judges still declared him the winner, likely in exchange for not getting stabbed. But less than a year later, Nero died, which was terrible for his athletic career. The judges of Elis immediately declared that Olympiad to be invalid and struck Nero's name from the victors' list. And the games continued without further incident until AD 393, when the Christian Emperor Theodosius ordered them banned as a pagan rite, and not long after, the great temple of Zeus was destroyed. However, the Olympic Games had a run of almost 1,200 years. Hercules would have been proud. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, please let me know in the comments section. And tomorrow I'll have a new episode up focusing on great women of the Middle Ages.